I live in a small town, a place that at first glance might seem peaceful and without mysteries. I grew up here between the narrow streets and the cool wind that always seems to cut through the hot summer afternoons. The town is surrounded by mountains, vast fields, and dense forests, and it was in these fields that I first heard about the old house. I'm not a superstitious person, quite the opposite. I've always sought logical explanations for everything that happened to me. As someone who lives in a small town, I know every corner and the secrets it holds. But something happened to me that night, something that made me question everything I thought I knew, and it's about this experience that I'm going to share with you. It was a Friday night. It was already late and I had just finished work, tired and not in the mood to face the weekend. The weather was overcast, and the heavy clouds covered the sky, casting a gloomy hue over the town. I passed through the central square, where the weak streetlights barely illuminated the benches and trees that seemed darker than usual. I decided to take a shortcut that would get me home faster. A less traveled street, empty and quiet. I knew this path saved me time, but at the same time, it passed through places that had always unsettled me. This narrow street, almost lost on the town's map, was surrounded by an old worn wooden fence where the broken boards formed a labyrinth of shadows. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps echoed, and the wind made the branches of the trees sway, creating noises that made me feel like I was being watched. But it was nothing out of the ordinary. I knew these sensations could just be my mind overwhelmed by exhaustion. But as I neared the end of the street, something started to catch my attention. The house at the end of the road, it had always been there since I was a child. I knew its stories. They said that a very private family lived there, almost isolated from the rest of the town. But the most intriguing part was that one day, this family simply disappeared. There were no explanations. No one saw anything, and since then the house had been uninhabited, and of course no one dared to go near it. The stories about the house, however, began to spread. Some said it was cursed. Others said the house was a place where people who got lost became part of it. I, until that moment, had always considered these stories nonsense. However, that night something made me stop. I don't know exactly what. Something in the air felt different. Maybe it was the tiredness, the stillness of the town that night, or even the growing feeling that I was being watched. As I passed through the rusty gate of the house, something pulled me inside. There was no reason to go in, but an invisible force seemed to push me. I stopped at the entrance of the house, looking at the old wooden door that was slightly ajar. The sound of the wind cut through the silence, but the atmosphere felt like a battlefield between fear and curiosity. I took a deep breath, and without being able to control the urge to know what was inside, I pushed the door open with a long creak. As I entered, the feeling that I was in another place, another time, was immediate. The house was engulfed in a heavy darkness, almost tangible. There was no electricity, and the moonlight filtered through the broken windows barely illuminated the space. Each step I took on the wooden floor creaked, breaking the absolute silence. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and aged wood. The walls were covered in layers of dirt and remnants of wallpaper that had peeled off over time. The place seemed frozen in the past, as if the hours there had never passed. I walked slowly, not knowing exactly what I was looking for. As I moved through the rooms, I noticed that time there seemed to have stopped. There were no signs of vandalism, no scattered furniture. Everything seemed intact, but strangely out of place. I found myself drawn to the dark corridor at the back of the house where a door was ajar. The faint light of a candle seemed to flicker from there, swaying with the movement of the wind coming through the cracks in the windows. With my heart racing, I approached the door. The candle was lit, but as I looked around, there was no one. Everything was in complete silence. I entered, not knowing what to expect. But what I found inside was something that would haunt me for a long time. The room was empty, except for an old dark wooden chair facing the broken window. The chair was positioned strangely, as if someone had just left, but in a way that didn't make sense. It was as if the chair was waiting for someone. The silence was almost complete, but there was a feeling that something was moving, something I couldn't identify. And it was then that I heard the whisper for the first time. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but something inside me knew it wasn't just the sound of the wind. I stood still, my breath quickening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The whisper repeated, almost like a breath in my ear, but when I looked around, there was no one. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, the pressure in my chest becoming more intense. I wanted to leave, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. I couldn't think clearly anymore. The feeling of an invisible gaze seemed to pierce through me. I looked at the chair, as if it were the key to everything, and then something moved in the window. For an instant, I saw a shadow pass behind the torn curtain. My mind started to question everything. Who could be there? And what had happened to that family? What was at stake inside that house? My body finally began to react. A deep instinct made me step back, but before I could turn to run, I saw something even more disturbing. In the reflection of the broken glass of the window, a figure stood behind me, as if it had stepped out of the glass itself, materializing in the reflection. I froze. I didn't know if it was my mind or if something was truly there. With a scream stuck in my throat, I turned and ran out of the house, feeling the pressure in my chest increase with every step. I ran, not looking back, until I reached the street where the moonlight seemed softer, as if it was welcoming me. And as the cold air touched my face, I realized that the house wasn't just an abandoned place. It was alive. It knew who entered, and somehow it didn't let you leave unscathed. Since that night, I can't pass by that house without feeling a shiver down my spine. Something moves there, something that doesn't belong to this world. And even though I try to rationalize it, a part of me knows that what I saw, heard, and felt in that house cannot be explained. To this day, I wonder if anyone will ever have the courage to discover what really happened to the family that lived there. But the only thing I know is that if you ever pass by that house, if you ever get close to those crumbling walls, maybe you'll feel the same chill I felt. Maybe you'll also hear the whisper, and if you're brave enough to go in, maybe you'll never be able to leave. I live in a small town. Contrary to what many might think, it's nothing famous or noteworthy except for a dark story that circulates among the older folks. I grew up hearing stories about that place. Since I was a kid, my friends always talked about the old stone building on top of the hill, a building that had been abandoned for over 30 years. What initially seemed like just an urban legend about an asylum where, they say, strange things happened over time, turned into a legend that haunted my mind. The adults avoided talking about the place, and whenever the name asylum was mentioned, the older folks would look at the ground and quickly change the subject. Like any curious teenager, I always wanted to know what was really behind all these stories. I knew that no one would ever dare to go there, but something told me I had to. Something told me I could be the first to uncover the truth. The story of the asylum had been the same for years. They said that in the 60s, the institution was the scene of cruel medical experiments, something about experimental treatments on patients who were mostly in desperate situations. The conditions were horrible, and many of the inmates never left. Some people claimed that the doctors and nurses of the time were anything but humane, that they considered the patients more like guinea pigs than human beings. After a series of protests and scandals, the place was shut down, but it was never demolished. And so it stood, slowly being consumed by vegetation and legends. On a hot Friday afternoon, tired of hearing all the stories and feeling like my curiosity was turning into obsession, I decided I was going there. It wasn't an impulsive decision. I had already mentally prepared myself for it. I grabbed my backpack, put in a flashlight and some water, and headed up the hill where the asylum was located. The path there wasn't easy. The trail was covered with thick, thorny vegetation, and as I climbed, the sound of the town faded away until it disappeared completely. I arrived at the site just before dusk. The asylum was there, imposing and macabre, staring at the town like a silent beast. The stone walls, already worn by time, seemed to tell a story of abandonment and suffering. The windows were broken, some still had rusted bars, and others were completely shattered. The roof, covered in moss and soot, gave the impression that time had definitely conquered that place. The air around it was thick and stagnant, lacking the freshness of the town. The silence was absolute, and the only sound was the wind passing through the trees and the steps of my own walk. I stood still in front of the rusted iron gate, which was ajar. At first I hesitated. What had brought me here? Why was I so obsessed with going inside? But the feeling that something was calling me was too strong. I went in, and the sound of the gate creaking made the silence even more oppressive. The inside was even darker than I had imagined. The air was dense, stuffy, as if time had stopped there. I could feel the dampness of the walls, the smell of mold, the sensation that I was invading a place that should have been forgotten. But something inside me refused to leave. I had to know what really happened there. I walked through the dark hallways, and with each step, fear began to take over me. The walls were marked, some with bloodstains, others covered with what appeared to be remnants of fabrics and torn clothes. On the wooden floor, marks of footsteps could still be seen, as if the place had never been fully abandoned. The feeling that something was moving around me, that I wasn't alone, intensified. Then I heard for the first time a sound. a low echo almost inaudible but present. It was as if someone was whispering, but from a distance, like a scream trapped within the walls of the building. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was the wind or the sound of my own breath, but the noise persisted, coming from a hallway further ahead. Something inside me wanted to keep going, but another part told me to turn back. But curiosity once again won. I moved toward the sound. As I got closer, the atmosphere became more oppressive. The whispering grew louder. I couldn't understand what was being said, but the sensation that someone or something was waiting for me took my breath away. The light of my flashlight flickered in my hands, and I could see the shadows moving on the walls, even though I didn't understand how that was possible. When I finally reached the room where the sound seemed to be coming from, I stopped at the door. There was nothing there, just more walls, more darkness. However, as I stepped inside, the flashlight began to flicker. I noticed that the floor was covered with marks of something that appeared to have been dragged. With each step, the shadows grew denser. The whispering was now clearer, but it wasn't coming from any specific place. It was in the air all around me, inside me. That's when I saw in a corner of the room something that shouldn't have been there. A chair, an old wooden chair with leather straps as if it were a restraining chair. It was facing the wall, and upon closer inspection I saw deep marks and scratches on it. It was impossible to deny what I felt. This place had been the scene of something horrible, something that should never have been forgotten. That's when the whispering stopped, and in the absolute silence that followed, a cold sensation took over me, as if something was watching me. And then something moved in the darkness. I don't know exactly what it was. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the asylum had been so marked by suffering that even the air there was saturated with it. But in that moment, I knew that something very dark still lingered inside those walls. Something that should never have been awakened. I ran. I ran like never before. I didn't look back. I don't know if the whispering continued, if the shadows were still there. All I know is that when I reached the entrance, the air felt lighter. The night outside was quieter, and I felt a sense of relief being back in the safety of the town. But as I descended the hill, a part of me knew that place would never leave me in peace. To this day, when I pass by the hill, I can't help but look at the asylum. I can't help but feel that something inside still calls to me. Maybe the Virginia asylum was never really abandoned. Maybe it's never left my mind. Whatever happened in that place still echoes, and like a ghost, it remains with me. My name is Lucas. I live in a small town surrounded by mountains and fields, where old stories are passed down from generation to generation. Although the town has its rustic charm, there is one place that has always given me chills: the Hill Cemetery, located atop an isolated hill, a good distance from the town center. I've heard of this cemetery since I was a child. They said it was a place where souls did not rest in peace, a place where inexplicable events happened, and where, from time to time, the evenings seemed to last longer than usual. The stories about the cemetery were a mix of legend and mystery. Some said that the dead buried there were never truly laid to rest, that something kept them in that place, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. I've always been skeptical, never believing in the stories that circulated among the town's older folks. After all, the cemetery was just that, a place of eternal rest for those who had passed. But after a strange event, something I personally experienced, my perception changed completely. It happened on an autumn afternoon. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy as if the weather itself was filled with something that couldn't be explained. I had gone to the town to take care of some errands, and on my way back I decided to take a detour to shorten the path. I'm not easily scared, so when I realized I was nearing the Hill Cemetery, curiosity took hold of me. What was really there? What did those old folks whisper about that place? The road leading to the cemetery was narrow, with tall trees and branches that seemed to intertwine, creating a tunnel of shadow through which the wind passed with a soft but unsettling sound. The cemetery was on top of a hill, and I knew I had to climb a steep stretch to reach it. With each step I took, the air grew heavier, colder. The feeling of being watched began to take hold of me, but I decided to ignore it. I reached the cemetery shortly after early afternoon. The rusted iron gate was ajar, as if inviting me in. The path to the interior was covered with dry leaves, and the sound of my footsteps was the only thing that broke the absolute silence. There was no one there. The cemetery was quiet, but in an unusual way, it was as if time had stopped in that place. The tombstones were old, covered in moss and dirt. Some had inscriptions that time had almost completely erased, while others seemed too new for such an ancient place. But what caught my attention, and immediately made my heart race was one particular tombstone. It was set apart from the others, hidden in the shadows of an old tree. The name on the stone was covered in moss, but I could make out a few words. Maria, 1911-1936. The strangest thing was that the tombstone seemed almost new, as if it had been placed there recently, but I knew that couldn't be possible. The feeling that something was wrong grew. The silence was now heavier, and the wind seemed stronger, almost as if it were trying to warn me about something. I approached the tombstone, feeling the cold intensify with each step. That's when I heard it. The sound, low but clear, of something being dragged. I stopped. I stood still, listening carefully. The sound came from behind the tombstone, from the side where the tree stood, but there was nothing there. Nothing that could explain the noise. I looked around, trying to find a logical explanation. There was no one nearby, nothing that could have made that sound. My heart began to race faster. The sound stopped, but the feeling that something was about to happen was inescapable. Suddenly, the wind stopped. The silence grew even denser, and it was at that moment that the evening began to stretch in a strange way. The sun, which should have been setting soon, seemed to hesitate on the horizon. I looked up at the sky, but the clouds were too heavy to let the sunlight through. The darkness seemed to approach slowly but steadily. What was once a normal afternoon now felt like an eternal night. I didn't know what was happening, but something inside me told me I shouldn't stay there any longer. However, an invisible force seemed to be holding me in that place. I looked again at Maria's tombstone, and that's when I noticed something written on one of the edges of the stone. It was a small inscription, almost faded, that said, "Never will depart." The message seemed to have been engraved recently, but the stone was too old for that. The wind suddenly returned, now stronger than ever, and the dry leaves flew through the air, making a shrill sound. I took a step back, but fear had already taken hold of me. Suddenly, a distant sound of footsteps began to echo through the cemetery. They came from the back, where the tombstones were closer together. The sound was unmistakable, as if someone were walking among the graves. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground beneath me had become denser. The feeling of being watched grew with each passing second. I tried to turn and leave, but the path to the exit seemed longer than before. The trees around the hill seemed taller, and the darkness which now consumed the cemetery seemed to move as if it were alive. I was no longer alone. It was then that when I looked back, I saw a figure, something human-shaped, slowly approaching between the graves. I couldn't make out any details, but enough to know that it wasn't an ordinary person. It was like a shadow, a distorted reflection of what should be human. The figure moved silently, its steps light and unhurried. It was coming in my direction. Fear paralyzed me for a moment. I didn't know what to do. I knew I was in a place where something beyond death lingered in the air, something that shouldn't be there. I couldn't stay any longer. I took a deep breath, turned around and ran for the exit as fast as I could. The feeling that something was following me stayed with me until I reached the gate, and when I finally reached it, I looked back and saw nothing. I ran to my car, not daring to look back, and only when I entered my house did I finally manage to breathe more easily. But to this day, whenever I pass near the hill, I feel that the evening in that region is unlike any other. The hill cemetery has something that the living do not understand. It seems to exist in a limbo between the world of the dead and the living, where time and souls intertwine. And Maria, the woman on the tombstone, may never have truly left. Perhaps she still walks there, waiting for someone, waiting for me. And those were today's stories. If you've witnessed something, tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like to show that you enjoyed today's stories. See you in the next video, if you have the courage to return.